Howdy, friends. I'm Joel Empey, and welcome to another episode of Joel Empey Talks MMA. And on today's episode, we're going to look forward to UFC Sao Paulo. We're going to preview the top 3 fights on the main card and just run through the prelims a little bit, just some of the fights on the prelims. It's really quite a stacked preliminary card that's really flying under the radar. And we're going to take a little bit of a retrospective look at UFC Moscow from this past weekend. And specifically, we're going to start by talking about whether or not Zabit is ready for a title shot. So Zabit Magomedsharipov had a huge win this past weekend over Calvin Kattar. And a lot of people now think that he should be next in line for a title shot in the featherweight division after the upcoming title shot with Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway taking place next month. And I kind of disagree. I think Zabit really needs one more to prove that he's fully seasoned and ready to go. So Zabit has been a really highly touted prospect ever since he entered the UFC. He's a guy who trains with Mark Henry and Frankie Edgar, Eddie Alvarez, Marlon Mirage, the list goes on. He trains in a really, really credible camp. And all these guys like Frankie Edgar and all the other guys I was listing were really championing Zabit's reputation on his rise and his pre-UFC career when he was fighting over an ACB and things like that. You heard Frankie Edgar and these other members from Mark Henry's team out there really talk up Zabit and sing his praises, how he's the next great up-and-coming fighter to come from their gym. And I'm not here to say that Zabit's not that great. I think he is very great. He's 6-0 in the UFC. Most recently has beaten Jeremy Stephens and Calvin Kattar. I mean, that's no joke at all. He has an extremely impressive pedigree and record right now. And if you look at everybody that's ranked ahead of him, it's, Aldo and Edgar who are both dropping, and Edgar, and him aren't going to fight each other anyways. And then Ortega, who's fighting TKZ, the Korean Zombie, coming up here pretty soon. And then we've got, obviously, Volkanovski taking on Holloway. So a lot of people think that Zabit should be, next for these guys. The reason why I disagree is because look at, Zabit's fight against Kyle Bochniak, or his fight against his 2 most recent fights against Stephens and Kattar. In all 3 of those fights, he was fading in the 3rd round. We haven't seen Zabit fight for a 5-round fight yet, so I would prefer to give Yair Rodriguez. If you were just going to have to say who you're going to give a title shot to out of those 2, I'd rather give it to Yair, because at least Yair has a 5-round win in his career. At least he's been in there for 5 rounds before. I really thought that with a win here, Zabit would potentially elevate himself, but like I was saying last week. But I didn't realize, and this is on me, I didn't do my research properly. I didn't realize that the title fight in UFC Moscow was only going to be 3 rounds. I thought it was going to be a 5-round main event, like it always is, right? But I guess, and it makes sense because it was short notice. Alexander Volkov and Junior Dos Santos were supposed to be the 5-round main event. Dos Santos had to back out. Greg Hardy slips in. They don't want to put Greg Hardy in short notice on a 5-round, so they move that to the co-main event. Zabit, obviously Greg Hardy wasn't as big of a name as well. So Zabit and Calvin Kattar get promoted to the main event, but it was at the 11th hour, only a couple of weeks before the fight, so they couldn't change it from 3 rounds to 5 rounds because these guys had already gone through the majority of their training camp as a 3-rounder. Anyways, I digress from all of that. We only got to see Zabit in there for 3 rounds instead of 5 rounds, and we saw him fading in the 3rd round again. We saw that against Kyle Bochniak, who is, no offense to Kyle Bochniak, he's a very entertaining and quality fighter, but I don't think he's a top 10 caliber guy. I don't think he's, storming the gates of the featherweight division. But he was able to put it on Zabit in the 3rd round of their fight. Jeremy Stephens as well was able to put it on Zabit in the 3rd round of their fight. And Jeremy got kicked in the nuts so hard by Zabit in the 1st round of that fight. Who knows? Jeremy Stephens, was that close to winning that fight, really. He won the 3rd round, and he got kicked in the nuts really bad in the 1st round. That's good. That's going to slow you down a lot. If that's a 5-round fight, I think Jeremy wins that. If it's a 5-round fight, Calvin Kattar maybe wins against Zabit. So we need to... There's just a shadow of a doubt. You can't put him into a 5-round title fight, in my opinion, when he's never shown an ability to go for 5 rounds in his UFC career so far. So then what should be next for Holloway if Zabit isn't next? Because Holloway, or I shouldn't say that, because Volkanovski could beat Holloway for sure. I'm not writing Volkanovski out. I'm not writing Volkanovski off at all. But so the winner of Volkanovski and Holloway, who should be next for them? I think if it's a controversial finish or something, as barring a controversial finish or a really close split decision in favor of Volkanovski or something like that, where it permits a rematch for those two, I think if TKZ beats Brian Ortega, Yair you could throw in there. It's kind of murky waters right now because the big players, right, are obviously Volkanovski and Holloway, who are fighting each other next month. And then you've got the Ortega-TKZ matchup, which is TBD. We don't know how that's going to go down. And then you've got Yair and Zabit, and those are really all of the players. I would love to finally see. We've been teased. It's been booked before and then taken off the books. Zabit versus Yair, 5-round fight. These guys are the two hottest up-and-coming guys for years now in the featherweight division. They've been two of the hottest up-and-coming prospects with the flashiest styles, and they both got the long bodies to be able to deal with the length of Holloway potentially, right? I don't think I like either of their odds, but potentially, as a storyline, they have the length to be able to potentially deal with the length of Holloway and negate some of those advantages that Holloway has over almost everybody, like he will have over Volkanovski. So that's the fight that I would really like to see. And as far as who should be the next contender for Volkanovski and Holloway, I mean, let's see how Ortega and the Korean Zombie plays out. Let's see how this Volkanovski and Holloway fight plays out. I think if you're gonna shoehorn somebody into a title shot, I think you should shoehorn Yair in over Zabit. That's just my opinion. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with it, but until you see Zabit, and he hasn't even fought for 5 rounds yet, until you can at least, and he always fades in the 3rd round, so until you can see that he at least passes a championship rounds test, or at least gets booked for 5 rounds and finishes the guy before it gets to the championship rounds, I would even consider that a victory. But until we can see that type of cardio display from Zabit, I think that's the last test he has to pass before he gets his title shot. So I just don't think he's quite there yet. And also from UFC Moscow, I just briefly wanted to touch on Greg Hardy, and briefly because I'm kind of sick and tired of talking about him at this point. We had to talk about him because he had a fight recently against the Combat Wombat, and then he had the quick turnaround, so we had to talk about him again. And I don't have to talk about him today, but I feel like since it was in the co-main from that UFC Moscow card, and it was a pretty big story, I feel like it should be addressed at least a little bit. And Greg Hardy. So one thing that I've noticed about Greg Hardy, and I could be reading into this wrong or whatever, but it just seems like he doesn't care. And when I say he doesn't care, I mean when he landed the illegal knee on Alan Crowder and lost by disqualification, it didn't seem like in the post-fight when he's giving his remarks, it just seems like he doesn't care. He just has an attitude, and he says after this fight, he says, I'm crying on the inside, but he says it that monotone, and I just don't believe him. There's a real, I don't know if it's because he's already rich from football or whatever. I think he likes to fight, and it's but I don't think he doesn't care. He's not all in. I don't think he's all in the way that he needs to be for a guy who only just started training in 2016. So I question what his upper limit is. I don't think he has an upper limit of actually being able to compete in the top 15 of the UFC. I don't think he'll ever be there. And we saw he has, great athleticism. He has, decent hands or whatever, but after the Combat Wombat thing with the whole inhaler gate in the post-fight, he once again was like, the way that he says, I'm extremely disappointed. And it's just, he says it in such a monotone fashion, and I just don't believe him. And I don't know if maybe he really does mean these things, but it comes across so monotone because he's so jaded because of his checkered past. He's been through so many more troubled times than, an inhaler in an octagon. So So maybe his jaded idea towards these losses and issues in his career, maybe that's because he's dealt with so much so much hardship in his career, as a football player, with all the domestic violence stuff and everything else. So it just seems like, and then, after he lost to Volkov, it just seemed like he doesn't care. It seems like he doesn't care to me. And when you really break it down, he's 31 years old. He only just started training in 2016 at, 28 years old. He started his combat career. Somebody like Volkov, who started fighting professionally at 21 and trained his life, up until 21, and then starts fighting professionally. And these guys, if you read anybody's name in the top 15, they all have such a head start on Greg Hardy. And I used to believe, before this past weekend, I really thought, and I could still be wrong. I really did think, though, that Greg Hardy had top 15 upside. I didn't think he was championship level of potential, but I thought he had top 15 type of upside just with his athleticism and everything else. I don't think so anymore. I think anybody with really credible, competent striking is going to give him serious issues. It remains to be seen what his grappling is like. Like, could you imagine if, a Curtis Blades got their hands on him? I just don't think Greg Hardy has that high of an upside anymore. I'm not sold on his upside anymore. And it's very obvious he needs to take a significant step back in the rankings now. I'm skeptical about Greg Hardy's upside in his upper limit at this point. So this UFC Sao Paulo card coming up this Saturday has been getting some flack for not having depth to it and not being a really quality card. And I would push back on that just a little bit, because if you look at the undercard of this card, I mean, there's quite a number of interesting fights that are competitive and compelling to witness. And then the top 3 fights on the main card are all interesting. So I'll just list the fights that are on the undercard that I'm really fascinated in. And that's, so one fight, Douglas Silva de Andrade versus Renan Barão at featherweight. Renan Barão, former bantamweight champion of the UFC. Douglas Silva de Andrade, great UFC record to this point. He's been a guy as well that's fluctuated between the 2 weight classes. And so this is going to be a great featherweight scrap. Warlley Alves versus Randy Brown. Warlley Alves, one of the most criminally underrated welterweights out there, and Randy Brown has been, very excellent as well. That's a phenomenal fight. Francisco Trinaldo versus Bobby Green, another fantastic fight. Francisco Trinaldo is just an ageless wonder. And then Bobby Green, always exciting, loves to brawl. He's been on many main cards in his career, just like Trinaldo. And the main event on the prelims, Sergio Mirage versus James Krause. That's a banger of a fight. Another just banger of a welterweight fight. James Krause, so skilled and smooth and technical. Sergio Mirage, jiu-jitsu champ. It's just, good hand power as well. Great fights there. And to be honest, the top 3 fights on the main card are all phenomenal. But the 2 fights before the 3 main fights on the main card, I just don't really care about. And if you could have just slotted any of the 2 fights that I just listed from the undercard to be the first 2 fights before the, top 3 fights on the main card, then this would actually be a legit, free card. So people saying that it's, not a great card or whatever, I think on the undercard, there's a number of compelling fights. And I think the top 3 fights on the main card, Charles Oliveira versus Jared Flash Gordon, phenomenal fight. Shogun Rua versus Paul Craig, the Bear Jew, phenomenal fight. Compelling, entertaining. Not the greatest fight the UFC could put on. Very going to be guaranteed war, highly entertaining. And then the main event, Jacare making his 205-pound debut, taking on Jan Blachowicz, who is seeing a little Groundhog Day deja vu, having to take on another elite middleweight contender, making their light heavyweight debut in the UFC. I mean, the main card, those top 3 fights are all legit as hell. Then plus all the legit fights on the undercard. Like I said, if you could put 2 of those undercard fights on the main card to replace the first 2 main card fights, that's a 5-fight main card that I would be real excited for. So with all these fights in the undercard, I'm going to make sure to check out the undercard. And let's get into breaking down the top 3 fights for the main card. Like Charles de Bronx Oliveira taking on Jared Flash Gordon. Going to be a great fight. Basically, Oliveira, if you don't know him very well, he has the most submissions in UFC history. Now, I wouldn't say he's the greatest submission specialist in UFC history. He's top 10 for sure, top 5 maybe even. But yeah, he just finds the way to sink them in. And he doesn't have, he has competent striking and whatnot. So people aren't just so, enamored and worried about his grappling like they are with a Damian Maia or a Jacare, to where that's just your primary focus when you're fighting him. I mean, your primary focus when you are fighting Oliveira is to not get submitted, for sure. But it's not so forefront in your mind like it would be when you're fighting Kron Gracie, Brian Ortega, Ryan Hall, Damian Maia, Jacare Souza, one of the absolute tip of the spear elite guys. And I'm not saying, once again, I may not be verbalizing this exactly correct. I'm not saying Oliveira isn't, tip of the spear in his submission game. He is, but it's not quite to the same degree as these all-time great BJJ specialists. So because of that, I think he gets a little bit more opportunity to sink in submissions. Plus, he's had such an immensely long UFC career that the career longevity definitely plays into his most submissions. But he's got 13 submissions in his UFC career. He's looking for to break out of unlucky 13 and get to lucky 14. Is that a thing? Against Jared Flash Gordon, Jared Gordon, just a brawler, dude. One of these guys who's a former drug addict who used martial arts as an avenue to get away from drug addiction. So this guy can just go to the dark place, in his mind, and he can brawl and go to that dark place internally and really force a brawl, a crazy hectic fight, which is what he's going to try to do, because obviously you don't want to grapple with Oliveira, you don't want to get submitted by him. So Gordon's going to look to make this fight a brawl. Oliveira's going to look to capitalize on Gordon's overstepping in certain situations and try to force it, get a clinch, get into the grappling situation and look for his submissions. This is going to be a banger of a fight. Very interesting matchup in the lightweight division. Then in the co-main event, we have MMA legend Shogun Rua taking on Paul the Bear Jew Craig. And if you haven't seen Paul Craig fight, get ready to watch a war, because Paul Craig just makes he's a Scottish guy. He always comes out in the weigh-ins, the Braveheart, face paint and everything. This guy, he just wars everybody, because he just presses forward and looks for the clinch, and he looks to get submissions. That's all he looks to do. And he takes immense damage in the process. He takes an immense amount of damage because he's just relentless with the way he presses forward, and he's just hunting for the submission. He is just aggressively going for the submission. It's very interesting because jiu-jitsu is considered to be more of a passive art of grappling. He forces the issue with his jiu-jitsu just from the jump. He just goes after you and tries to submit you. He has 12 wins in his career, 11 by submission, just 1 by knockout. He has none of his fights in his UFC or in his MMA career have ever gone to decision. If he's ever lost, it's been by getting finished. So he just is relentless, utter disregard for his own health and safety. He is just trying to force the issue and achieve his own offense, regardless of the damage that he takes to himself. Now, Shogun is he's for sure past his prime, right? He's for sure past his prime, but most recently, he did knock out Tyson Pedro, who was, a bit of a rising contender in the 205-pound weight class, a young guy with a lot of hype behind him, and Shogun did knock him out. That was, about a year ago, and that was Shogun's most recent performance, but with Paul Craig's propensity for taking damage, Shogun still has some fight left in the tank. He's gonna, be at home in Brazil, so that's gonna give him some extra juice, if you know what I mean, maybe. And then his most recent fight was a knockout against a rising contender in Tyson Pedro. I think that this might be a vintage Shogun Rua performance. 21 of Rua's 26 wins. 21 of Shogun's 26 wins are by TKO or KO. So I think we're going to get to see another vintage Shogun Rua performance in this one. And I don't know how many more of those we're going to get to see. So if you're a fan of classic Shogun like I am, you better tune in this weekend, because this is you're probably going to get to see a great performance out of Shogun. He's going to at least have a great opportunity to have a great performance, and this might be one of the last ones you're ever going to get to see of him. And now let's break down the main event of the evening as Jan Blachowicz takes on Ronaldo Jacare Souza. Jacare making his light heavyweight debut in his career, not just in the UFC, in his career as well. And, it's kind of deja vu for Jan. I might have mentioned this a little bit earlier, but Jan's last fight was against Luke Rockhold, who was also, at the time, was making his light heavyweight debut in his career and in the UFC. And for Jan, it's a situation where you're taking on a guy who's extremely skilled, but has, no competitive background in the division. So beating this person doesn't really, they have no divisional clout. It should be how I should describe it. Luke Rockhold and Jacare have no divisional clout in the light heavyweight division. So defeating these guys who are world class in terms of their skills, nobody is going to argue that. World class in terms of their skills doesn't advance you in the same way that beating somebody who has, divisional name recognition, has, clout in the division, significant wins over light heavyweight contenders would. So for Jan, it's just a rough situation, because you have to go out there and beat Luke Rockhold. And, what does everybody say when you beat Luke Rockhold? Well, Rockhold hasn't been himself lately. He's been on mostly a losing skid. He's making his light heavyweight debut. You're fighting a debuting fighter. And what are they going to say if he beats Jacare? They're going to say, well, Jacare, sure, he, in his last, 3 fights, he's 2-1. His only win over Chris Weidman, and he was losing that fight, and Weidman's clearly over the hill as well. So he only barely beaten over the hill Weidman, and then he's, lost to Kelvin, and he's lost to Hermanson. So, what does that even mean? So Jan is once again stuck in a situation where he's got to beat one of the most skilled fighters on the planet, and he's not going to really advance in the divisional rankings for this. He's number 6 right now. Is he going to get higher than number 6 for winning this fight, even if he wins by knockout? Knockout Luke Rockhold, knockout Jacare back-to-back. Is he going to even rise in the rankings? Probably not. And for Jan, this sucks even worse, having to fight Rockhold and Jacare back-to-back, because there's been a dearth of contenders in the light heavyweight division in 2019. Jan hasn't fought since July because there hasn't been anybody for him to fight. Dominic Reyes, had a significant win a month or so ago, and now Dominic Reyes is clearly the next contender for Jon Jones. But if Jan could have, gotten, instead of wasting 2019, not wasting, but instead of spending 2019 fighting these blown up middleweights making their debuts, he could have really forwarded himself in the division. And, you really feel bad for Jan, because it's like the UFC is trying to do him dirty. You know what I mean? They tried to propel Luke Rockhold. They also tried to do this to Dom Reyes with Chris Weidman, because Weidman, Rockhold, Jacare, these guys are all bigger names than Blachowicz and Reyes. So they're trying to pit these guys, Jacare and Rockhold, against Jan, hoping that they can get one over on Jan, who is a legit, name and contender in their division. So that way the names of Rockhold or Jacare can take on Jon Jones, which sells the UFC more pay-per-views at the end of the day. So the UFC is trying to do Jan dirty a little bit. Now Jan has the opportunity to prove them wrong and to win these fights. And whoever does win this fight between Jan and Jacare, and I do think it will be Jan. I think it'll be Jan because, as we saw in the Rockhold fight, Jan is immensely strong. He has tremendous takedown defense. He is a BJJ black belt, which, if it goes to the ground, I don't think that... I think Jacare, if they're on the ground and Jacare's on top of him, I believe Jacare will find a submission. But having a BJJ black belt, having incredible takedown defense, very good physical strength, like he stopped Luke Rockhold's takedowns the entire fight. Luke Rockhold didn't get him down at all. And Luke's a very accomplished wrestler who is touted for his grappling and wrestling ability. Probably the strongest part of his game. And he couldn't do anything to Jan. So I just don't think Jacare is going to be able to offensively wrestle Jan to be able to put the fight in his world of grappling. So because of that, I believe the fight is going to contest mostly on the feet, where I believe Jan has a power advantage for sure. Definite hand power advantage. We've seen that Jan's got bricks in his hands. And I believe he does have a technical striking advantage. So his technical striking advantage and power advantage, and then takedown defense, overall grappling background, being able to help him keep the fight on the feet, to use his technical and power advantage with his striking, makes me favor Jan in this one. And I think that the winner of this one, whether it is Jan or Jacare, should take on Corey Anderson for the next number one contender to contend for the light heavyweight belt after Dominic Reyes and John Jones have their title bout in early 2020. Now, I know Jan and Corey already fought each other, and it was a bit of a Jan. Sorry, bad pun. When they fought each other, they were both unranked. That was over 4 years ago, and they were both unranked. Right now, they're currently ranked 5 and 6. And since that loss, Jan's been, he has had some losses since then, but he's worked his way up from being unranked to being the number 6 guy. And Corey Anderson, off of that win, was able to work from being unranked to being the number 5 guy. So these guys have developed so much in their careers since they last fought. And they're both at the top of the division. If you look at everybody ranked ahead of them, they're either, taking sabbaticals, or, our Dominic Reyes, who already is going to be contending for John Jones' belt next, or their Cormier, who is, off. So these guys at number 5 and 6, Anderson and Jan, are clearly the next guys. And if Jacare beats Jan, I think Jacare rightfully takes that spot. And the winner of that fight, you really look at the light heavyweight division, they need more contenders. So the winner of that fight would for sure be the number 1 contender, and would have a rightful, have the right to claim that number 1 contendership after the win streaks that both those guys would be on. Or, Jacare, if he were to come in and beat Jan and Corey Anderson, you could justify a title shot for sure. And, if Jacare does win, and Jacare, he's a live dog. He's absolutely in the mix here. If Jacare does win, it's going to be interesting for the light heavyweight division. So in that aspect, I kind of hope Jacare wins. I hope Jan wins, because it seems like the UFC is trying to do him dirty back-to-back times. And I like to root for the little guy over the big company in that kind of a situation. But if Jacare wins, all of the matchups at light heavyweight are fresh for Jacare. He hasn't fought any of these guys, and he presents nobody else at light heavyweight. I was saying Paul Craig, but he's not an elite guy. But nobody else at light heavyweight is really hunting the submission as their primary tactic for victory. So he would present a new style and all fresh matchups for him. So if Jacare wins, it's pretty excellent as well. It'll be very entertaining to see what happens for him going forward. And conversely, if Jacare loses, it'll be awkward. I don't know. We'll have to see how he performs in the fight. If he gets knocked out viciously, I don't know where he goes from here. Just like with Weidman, not getting knocked out and losing, and Rockhold getting knocked out and losing, it's almost like if there are a lot of. I'm saying that there's a lot of stakes for Jan in this one. There's a lot of stakes for Jacare as well. Like, if he goes out there and gets knocked out, where do you go from here? You just abandon middleweight. I mean, do you go back down to middleweight? I guess that option's open, but that kind of doesn't feel right after going up to light heavyweight. But then At light heavyweight, who do you fight? You know, do you go outside the rankings if you're a guy with a name like Jacare and you're giving like a Sam Alvey a chance to make his name off of you? Are you really, into fighting the Sam Alveys of the world? No offense to Sam Alvey. You know what I mean? If you're Jacare, you're in an awkward position if you lose. So there's actually a lot riding on the line for both of these guys. If Jan wins, he doesn't get to improve his position. If he loses to, he's going to drop his position greatly. So he doesn't have much to gain. And then Jacare, if he loses, where does he go from here? There's a lot on the line for both these guys if they lose. And a win would be very significant for both of them. It would both put either of them, one fight away from a fight with whoever the champion is at light heavyweight, likely John Jones. So there is some to gain with a win, but there's so much on the line for both these guys if they lose. And that's what makes this a really, really compelling main event, because the stakes are very high for these two. All right, folks, so that does it for this episode of Joel MP Talks Mixed Martial Arts. I want to thank you for watching. I wish you would like the video if you did enjoy it. Please subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Twitter at MP Talks. I'll post more regularly over there, so you can find out my thoughts and opinions on UFC and NFL much faster if you follow me over there. Please comment below in the YouTube comments. I always appreciate comments and love going back and forth. If you have any opinions on anything I said, who you think is going to win any of these fights, let me know in the YouTube comments. And until next time, cheers, friends.